All right, so in 1986, it was widely believed that South Florida had only been inhabited for about 2,000 years by Native Americans. And down south, archaeologists discovered a sinkhole. And in this sinkhole, they found tons of interesting things. They found the remains of dire wolves, of saber-toothed tigers, of woolly mammoths here in Florida, in Palmetto Bay, right by the Deer Estate. And more interestingly, they found human remains. And the human remains dated back to 8,000 BCE, therefore pushing back our understanding of how long people have been living here. So what kind of Florida were people living in 8,000 years ago? What kind of environment were people living in here in Miami specifically as far back as we can date? So let's take a look at Florida 8,000 years ago, huh? Mamma mia, look at this. It was much larger than it was before. As you can see, over time, a lot of the landmass has sort of gone under the ocean. The Keys, which were really the high ground of the area, stayed as things started to submerge, right? And Miami, right over here, here we are, ta-da. Miami was not a coastal town. It was really inland. It was not very close to the ocean. And 8,000 years ago, Miami, the Miami area that we're standing on right now, would have been much like a, how do you put it, a grassy, what's the phrase? Knoll. Not a grassy knoll. Mamma mia! I'm sorry, I have a cold. So it was a grassy savanna. It was a lot of plains and a lot of high grass, and it was a sort of environment you would find saber-toothed tigers. You would find in woolly mammoths, blah blah blah. So, what do we know about the people who have been living here now that we know they've been living here for 10,000 years? So we commonly refer to these indigenous folks who we don't have an oral history, we don't have written history of them. We only have the histories written down by Spanish missions, right, when Spain came in, and those aren't really accurate or good sources, really, because it's really very biased. You know, the missions take on the Indians. So we refer to everyone who lived in this area, the descendants of the Tequesta community, right? So it's a wide range, and let's hone in a little bit. Now, this is a map. Ignore all this stuff. Now, this is a very important part to the rest of our story. Ignore this stuff, all right? This is the Miami River, and this is sort of the center stage for the story we're going to be telling. Now, here you have north of the Miami River, and this is downtown Miami. Flagler Street, you go down Biscayne, you know, you've got North Miami, the Olympia, and then down over here, you have Brickell, okay? And you go across over here, and you have Miami Beach, right? And you go down through here, through the actual Miami River, and it would have led into the Everglades. And it would have been a beautiful, beautiful subtropic sort of environment 2,000 years ago. We've hopped up 2,000 years. And it would have wound, and it would have been, there was no real shoreline. There was just lots of subtropic growth and palm trees, and it was winding and just so beautiful. There's pictures of it at the turn of the 19th century, and it's just absolutely beautiful. It's now a working river, of course, but this is center stage, so it's very important we understand Miami River, Miami Beach over here, downtown, and Brickell. So, on the north side, in downtown Miami, commercial archaeologists discovered this, right? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. This is the Miami Circle. Now, real quick, a commercial archaeologist is an archaeologist who is paid by a company who wants to build on some land, and there are ordinances in place now in Miami, thank God, that when you want to build something, you have to make sure that the land underneath it doesn't have any important archaeological facts, anything pertaining to indigenous communities and whatnot. So all of that is preserved or can be moved, God forbid, to build. So they knocked down a building and they built it. They were going to build a new building. Commercial archaeologists come in and they find this fucking thing, right? And it really changed the way that we understood the Miami area, right? So let's take a look at this super cool diagram, right? You can tell there was a septic tank there from the building before, and what you have essentially are a series of post holes, and this is dug into the rock. I mean, we have a really strong bedrock. It's very difficult to dig here because you dig a little bit and you hit limestone, you hit oolitic limestone, you hit coral rock. It's our limestone. It's our bedrock. It's very difficult to dig in, and people 2,000 years ago were able to carve substantial holes in a perfect circle, right? And we can deduce a lot from this. So post holes, right? Archaeologists are speculating that they were for posts, and then Across through here, you would have, palm sables, you would have palm fronds, and really interesting is you would have a row of post holes here, which would mean this part was all covered, right? And you have this really interesting architectural feature right here, which is this sort of like semicircle sunroof. Really very interesting. Interesting in Miami's architectural history, even though people don't really tend to go far back that much. We tend to think of Miami architecture. We tend to think of the late 1890s, the 1900s, and then so on. So here are some artistic representations of what people think this Tequesta settlement in downtown Miami would have looked like. Again, the north bank of the river, this is the Miami River right down through here, Miami Beach, and this is downtown. Brickell would have been across the bridge. So archaeologists have proved that people have lived in this spot in the north bank of the Miami River, downtown Miami, constantly for 2,000 years, right? 2,000 years. You think about how long this country's existed. I mean, it's minuscule compared to how long people had been settled along here. So what do we know about the Tequesta? We know that they didn't develop agriculture, right? And that's nothing to scoff at. They weren't too smart. They were too dumb to learn architecture. No, that's far from the truth. The area Miami was situated in and the environment and the ecosystem was so rich in natural resources that there was no need to develop agriculture. The bounty was just so rich. You had Biscayne Bay with all the ocean, with all the fish in the ocean. You have the fish from the river and everything that lives in the river. You have the animals in the rocky pinelands, and then in the subtropical hardwood forests, and then the Everglades. It's just, there's so much. So there wasn't a need to develop agriculture, and we find that these people very much lived off the land and didn't do too much to alter it in terms of agriculture. Right? Again, another depiction. Here we go, Miami River, downtown Miami, Flagler, the Olympia Theater. And that's a depiction of what that looks like. So all's going well until, oh my God, look at this. This gentleman right here is Pedro Menendez. Boo, boo. Now, this picture, when I first got it, it was really very, it's great, we're here, and the Indians are happy, and I kind of blurred it to make it look a lot more sinister. The Western suit, it's kind of this sort of vibe. So Pedro Menendez comes, and now Spain is in control of Florida now. We just are, right? We own you. We own Florida, all right? And what essentially colonization in this form is a lot like gentrification, right? I mean, there's not too much of the bloodshed is a little bit. But so Pedro Menendez comes to Florida, and he comes specifically to Miami, and he wants to gentrify it, right? I mean, he wants to colonize it. And how do they do that? How did the Spanish do that? They set up little McDonald's everywhere. I mean, Spanish missions. Right, and they would put these missions all over the place, and they were successful in some places more than in Miami. And what we're going to see following up is a pattern, really, of people Westerners trying to tame this isolated wilderness that it was Miami, and fail, and they're met with failure. And then you have Westerners come in again, and they try to tame the land, and then there's failure. So we're going to see a back and forth for a little bit. So the Spanish come, Pedro Menendez, and he sets up a mission. And, it doesn't work. It's really hot, the mosquitoes, it's isolated. It was very difficult to get boats in here at the time because the bay was so shallow. It's much deeper now because we've dredged it, but it was not naturally deep. It wasn't a good port. So it wasn't easy to get here. A little drink. So, okay, so it's an utter and complete failure, and they leave, and the Tequesta did not take to the Spaniards. There wasn't much violence. But there was a lot of death, mainly due in Miami to disease, and it just spread so quickly, and there really are no words for how many people died and how quickly they died, large amounts. So the Spanish, they give up in Miami, and they say, we can't do it. They're having better luck in Fort St. Augustine, right? They're having better luck in northern Florida, and maybe in the Keys even too. And then what happens? Who cares why? The British own Florida now, right? It's a whole thing, but we don't need to talk about that. So now the British own Florida, and they turn Florida into East Florida and into West Florida, right? And you see here a new and accurate map of East and West Florida, right? Accurate. They're fucking idiots. So the British take over, and they have a different plan on how to colonize Miami specifically. And they have this sort of policy where they give out land grants to wealthy folks, notable folks in England, So you would be given a couple thousand acres of land if you just made your merry way, you know, across the pond over to Florida, and you started to develop it, right? And started to develop agriculture and all of that. Nobody was really very interested in this, and about 100 years later, let me just say, thank God that the British didn't hold on to us longer, because what we now refer to as Biscayne Bay, the British referred to it as the Gulf of Sandwich, right? Gross. So, and for all intents and purposes, the Tequesta culture was largely wiped out. There is nothing, there are no folks around who are descendant of the Tequesta, so to speak. There might be DNA out there, right, in Cuba maybe, but that doesn't really, mean anything culturally. So the Tequesta are gone. So, oh my goodness, look, the United States owns Florida now. So it was the Tequestas, and then it was the Spanish, and then it was the English, and then it was the Spanish again, and then now the United States has got it. And this is an early rendering of the Florida seal. It's really kind of beautiful. It's also a romanticized version of what happened in Florida, right? We have a indigenous woman, a Tequesta woman, dropping orange blossoms onto the floor. There's a steamboat and, a sable palm over there, and it's very nice. Really, I mean, it's the indigenous, and, this Gilded Age greed and genocide is coming in on its merry way to, fuck everything up around here. But it's a beautiful seal nonetheless, and maybe we can reinterpret old symbols as opposed to just throwing them away and giving them new meaning, acknowledging, what has really taken place. Okay, so the English or the Americans have a different way to settle land. Now we're in the 1800s, right? We've gone from 8,000 BC to the 1800s. BCE, excuse me. I have to be progressive. So they have a process to settle the land because nobody owned the land and they wanted it to become productive, similar to the English, but on a more piecemeal scale. They enacted the Homestead Act, and the Homestead Act says that if you move into one of the areas that the Homestead Act has authority over in South Florida, if you move to South Florida, we'll give you 150 acres of land for free. You just have to live on it for 5 years, prove it up, build a farm, make it productive, and prove that you've done it. And then you get the land for free. So this is how they start doing it. And we start to see that people are starting to settle, right? These are the sorts of homes that these homesteaders, as they were called, would live in. And I just want to paint a picture. When you moved to Miami, and it wasn't called Miami at this time, when you moved to the area, you would have been in a completely isolated wilderness. The nearest town would have been Key West, which was actually thriving. It was one of the richest countries in the world. And you had something up north. But in terms of, let's say, Buena Vista to Coconut Grove, like 20, 25 people, consisting of families, right? Farmers. And it didn't really get off the ground, and it started to. All right, here's another example of a Kunti farm. And Kunti, I'm sure some of you will know a little bit about Kunti, maybe, if y'all are like plant folk. So, or arrowroot, right? So Kunti was the cash crop at the time in the 1800s, and it was used to make stews, thicken stews, kind of do your laundry. It was used as a starch. And I'm sure it's around here somewhere. Maybe Casey can show you some Kunti later, if it's here. If not, Kunti's nice. Maybe we should get some Kunti. Here's a nice romantic depiction of a homestead in the early 1800s, right? A wood frame vernacular home. You have Dade County slash pine, largely extinct now. You have the sable trees. It's really just a beautiful sort of environment. And a lot of people think of California and all that, and the West Coast as being the final frontier, right? But in reality, South Florida was really the forgotten frontier. It was very difficult to settle down here, and in most instances, Miami came in very late in the game compared to a lot of the cities in California, right? That were really picking up in the 1840s. With the gold rush, and there's a Miami gold rush connection that we'll talk about later. So things started picking up, and we have our first and only slave plantation in Miami before the Civil War. Boo! Boo! Major. So on the north bank of the Miami River, so where that settlement was with the Tequesta that they had lived for 2,000 years, downtown Miami, this is where the slave plantation was. It was a sugarcane plantation. It was run by a jerk named William Fitzpatrick. William English. And all's going well, people are moving in, and oh my God, look. So this is where the Seminole come into the picture. Now, we talk about, a lot of people tend to think of the Seminole and a lot of the Indian tribes Native American tribes around here as being indigenous to here when this is really not the case. It's a really powerful and storied history, especially that of the Seminole. Now, the Seminole are a breakaway tribe from the Creek, which is a nation, a Native American nation in sort of southern Georgia, northern Florida, right? And Seminole or Seminole means breakaway. It means runaway or renegade. And during the time in United States history when the U.S. government decided, hey, you know, all those Native Americans that were here when we got here, why don't we move every single one of them to Oklahoma? Every single one to Oklahoma. And they started doing that, and the Seminole were not about it. And they were one of the tribes that really, really resisted and fought back, and that resulted in the 3 Seminole Wars taking place in Central Florida, South Florida, and it scared people because people didn't want to get killed by a group of marauding Indians. And all the Native Americans were really trying to do was trying to just live in peace. And they had moved from their native lands in South Georgia, North Florida. They moved to Central Florida, and during the case of the 3 Seminole Wars, they started camping out in South Florida in the Everglades, where white folk couldn't get them. I mean, it was a real trek to get up there, and you really had to be tough as nails to do it. An important person during the 3 Seminole Wars is Osceola, right? He coordinated a famous attack on a kind of a jerk, really. There's this guy, right, and he was, his name was Sir Francis Dade. And Sir Francis Dade was really good at killing Indians and stuff like that. And, you know, the United States Army loved him for it. They, you know, gave him all the badges, and he was doing great. And everybody loved Sir Francis Dade. Well, he's here in South Florida wreaking havoc, committing genocide and all that. And so one day, Sir Francis Dade has a company of 100 men, and they're walking down around Central Florida, and Osceola leads a massacre. Oh my days! Look at this. So these are the Americans discovering the massacre of Sir Francis Dade, and everyone was so upset about it that they decided to rename the county Dade County, and it was called Dade County at the time. Right? Gross. So Dade County at the time was a much larger county. It basically sprawled from about north of the Keys to Jupiter. It was huge, and not very populated. So the 3 Seminole Wars were largely a failure for the United States, and the United States would not face this kind of failure again until Vietnam. And they hadn't experienced that sort of guerrilla warfare ever. It was the first time in the nation's history that the U.S. government had to deal with guerrilla warfare, and it's funny because the United States was born out of guerrilla warfare. So eventually, United States troops give up really on trying to relocate all the Seminole. They relocated some of them, but they gave up, and there were a couple hundred, right, that camped out in the Everglades, and they slowly started integrating into Western cultures. Here are some Seminole women out in the Everglades with a canoe carved out of a cypress tree. Right, and here's a little bit later when you start seeing a lot of integration with different patterns and you know how they express themselves in terms of fashion and whatnot and cultural attire, and we see that they're starting to make peace and things are a little bit more peaceful. They settled out in the Everglades and these sort of pine islands, and yeah, so the white people aren't as scared as anymore, and then they start coming down again, and here's a Coontie mill. And we start to see more and more people come down. And when I mean more and more people, I mean like, you know, 15 people, 20 people, 30 people, not a lot of people, okay? So here are some, and there was a large Bahamian population in Miami. And here are 2 Bahamian women in the area we know now as Coconut Grove. It's important to know that Coconut Grove and Buena Vista were both settlements prior to Miami. They were small sort of farming settlements. There were a lot of artists in Coconut Grove and writers. By a lot, I mean like there were like 15 people there, but they had a lot of property. And Buena Vista as well. And Buena Vista had a naturally deep port, so a lot of people who did want to come in here came into Buena Vista. Okay, here are some more Bahamians in Coconut Grove, right? This is somewhere along Grand Avenue.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now, South Florida then, being settled, and people are starting to realize that the area might have potential. It caught the attention of these 2 folks, right, who moved down here. We have Mary Brickell and William Brickell. Now, this is an interesting story. Let's do a little bit biography, right? That's fun, some biography. Now, William Brickell grew up in Ohio, And he, like many other folks his age during this time of history, went to the California Gold Rush. And he made a shit ton of money during the California Gold Rush, and he was primarily a prospector. He was digging for gold, got to get that gold, and he got the gold, and he made some money. So the gold runs out in California, and surprise, surprise, there's another gold rush. They discover gold somewhere else. Anyone know where they discovered gold? In Australia. So, homeboy goes all the way to Australia, and this time, instead of digging for gold, he gets in a much more profitable line of work, which is selling the supplies to folks who are digging the gold, right? So he and a partner make a lot of money, and they even build a hotel at some point in Australia. They built a couple buildings. There's more research needs to be done on the architecture that the Brickles were involved in the Gables, or excuse me, in Australia. And then, so while in Australia, making all this money off gold, right, he meets this very nice young English woman named Mary Brickle. And Mary Brickle was born in England, and she moved to Australia when she was 12, 14, and then later on she meets him. They fall in love, and then they go back to Ohio, and then all is great, and they make a bunch of money, and they get a little bored. And homeboy was a lot older than homegirl, and the cold was starting to get to people, and that was one of the things that led them to South Florida. Somebody had told them there's this place, you should go check out, you should buy some property, and they did that. And they bought property on the south bank of the Miami River, and they built this. Right, there's the Brickle family. So this is Brickle. This is literally where Brickle is right now. Again, so the Brickles were right here where Brickle is. They built their home right here, right? And then coming up next, we have our main protagonist to Miami's history, Miss Julia Tuttle, the mother of Miami. Mamma mia, look at this. So Julia Tuttle is a very important person. She is the only woman who founded a major city in the United States. She's really a very interesting character, and there needs to be a lot more recognition, I think, for Julia Tuttle and research and writings and all that. So Julia Tuttle comes to Miami in 1893, a widow, and she brings her kids, and she moves to the south bank or the north bank of the Miami River. And when she's there, she moves into, of all places, the slave barracks that was still there that William English had put hundreds of years ago, a couple hundred years ago, right? So she's temporarily in the slave barracks. You can see it right here. This is the north bank of the Miami River, and there's the Brickles. So there's the Brickle trading post. The Brickles traded with Indians. They had a trading post just west of their house, and they would trade with Indians who would come down the Miami River. So you have neighbors now. You have two folks, right? You have Julia Tuttle and you have the Brickles, right? So Julia really saw the area as having a lot of potential. She realized how naturally beautiful it was. It was just very isolated. It was very difficult to get people to come down there. If you came on a big boat, you had to go to the Keys and then get on a little boat and then come to Coconut Grove. It was really very difficult. There was no train, and that was the main thing. There was no train. And this is a time in the United States' history where we were trying to achieve manifest destiny, right? The bringing of the country together through the railroads, right? And this one gentleman, Mr. Henry Flagler, right? People call him Florida's daddy. I'm not so sure about that. Henry Flagler owned the Florida East Coast Railway, and he made a lot of money in Ohio with Rockefeller and Standard Oil. So after he was done with Standard Oil, we all know about all that and the disgusting wealth, right, that they had. So he comes down to Florida after he's made all his money, and he starts building what we call the Gold Coast, right? So he started in St. Augustine, right over here, which was an established city, the oldest city in America, and he starts building his railroad down. And he would stop and he would build a big fucking hotel, a giant hotel. And most of the times he would build these hotels in areas that were not developed. There were no towns, there were no cities. And around this hotel, a city would develop, right? So the railroad and the hotel were really kind of the lifeblood for South Florida at the time. So he's going down, and then he stops in Palm Beach, and he's like, fuck it, I'm done, right? All right, so here are some of the hotels he built: the Royal Poinciana and Palm Beach. You have the Breakers, and then Hotel Ponce de Leon. So I think two of these are still standing. I'm not so sure. So Julia says, "Hey Henry, why don't you bring your railroad down? Right? It's beautiful. You're gonna love it. Bring it, Henry. Come on, bring it." And Henry says, "No, I don't want to bring it." Henry was perfectly fine leaving the railroad going as far down to West Palm Beach. He's an old guy, made so much money. Maybe he was thinking, hey, I don't need any more money, although I don't believe that he thought that. Maybe he was just tired. Okay, so he says, no, 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 I don't want to. And Julia is very persistent, and she keeps trying to do this. She's very much lobbying for Miami's viability as an interesting place to build and to cultivate a community. So something happens. Fate takes its course, right? And oh my days, look at this. So in 1894 and 1895, there was a great and terrible freeze, right? And all of it was called the Great and Terrible Freeze, very dramatic. And it decimated Florida's citrus industry. And you can see here the results of this, this horrible weather disaster. So when citrus trees freeze, when they get below a certain level, they're just dead. It's done. Like, you have to plant new trees. And Florida's economy was absolutely dependent on oranges. And it wasn't just the people who farmed the oranges, it was the people who supplied the tools that would allow the farmers to farm the oranges, and, you know, the people who bought things with orange money. So entire communities were completely wiped out. Here's another sad picture. Oh, mama, look, all the oranges fell, mama mia. So they're all very upset. They've lost a lot of money. And entire communities are really wiped out. And you see a lot of migration because of this. You see people, it really shaped Florida's destiny, this natural disaster. And we'll see natural disasters continue to shape South Florida's destiny as we move forward. But, all right, there was one place where the oranges didn't wilt. And it was sunny Miami, right? Here's an orange blossom, here's some oranges. And Julia Tuttle, and this is the Miami origin story, so to speak. And it's a little romanticized because, you know, certain people are like, oh, well, technically this didn't happen, and technically it's a beautiful story, and it's mostly true, and you know, I'm going to tell it this way. If you want, like, the nitty-gritty boring facts, I'll give them to you later. But Julia Tuttle moves on the opportunity and takes a box and puts an orange blossom in it and leaves a note in it and says, hey, Henry, you know, our oranges are good. You know, they're still good. And Henry Flagler gets this box. He opens it up, and in this, there's a proposal too. Bring your railroad down, and me and the Brickles will give you half of our land. You can build a hotel, and you can do this, and that, and it'll be very profitable for you. And it's been proven now that when the rest of the citrus crop is wiped out, South Florida was good. Miami was good. It's where summer spends the winter, right? So Henry Flagler says, yes, I'll do it. So work started at that point to clear the land for the hotel, and Henry Flagler started building his railroad down. So you have all this stuff happening, racing the railroad coming down. They're trying to get this city, this sort of quote-unquote city ready before the railroad comes down. Here are Henry Flagler's men before the railroad's here, clearing the land, the groundbreaking for the Royal Palm Hotel, as it would be known. In the background, right across the Miami River, we see the Brickles home, right? And again, this would have been downtown Miami. That would have been Brickell. All those high-rises would have been right back there. Okay, here's a very tragic picture of the land being cleared for the Royal Palm Hotel. This is a photograph of Henry Flagler's workers blocking the view, which was reported to be 75 feet long and 30 feet tall. Right, it was a DeCesta burial ground dating back thousands of years. And there's a lot of mystery and speculation and conspiracy as to what happened with these bones. They were apparently, according to John Sewell, who wrote a lot about his experience working for Flagler and all this stuff, they were moved to a secret location nearby, whatever that means. I don't really have any false beliefs that John Sewell or any of those Westerners cared about the Indian burial ground. They might have thrown them into Biscayne Bay. We don't really know what happened, but it was huge, 70 feet long, 35 feet tall, and they destroyed it because it was ruining the view. Typical Miami, right? It's a lot of foreshadowing. So they start getting a sort of town ready, an infrastructure. So when people knew that Henry Flagler was going to be building a railroad in the hotel, people started coming and they started setting up businesses, and, you know, the railroad's coming down any day now, we're going to make a lot of money, that sort of thing. And they come down. So this is an early view of North Miami Avenue. Right, take that in. They're laying some infrastructure, some pipe. So this is North Miami Avenue. All right here. Anyone want to take a guess what this is? What spot this is? This is oh, very close. All right, so that's a conversation piece. Very good. All right, so this is Flagler, and this is Biscayne. Now notice that this is all water. Now, everything east of Biscayne is all dredged up. It wasn't like that. Biscayne used to be kind of like the East Coast or the Pacific West Coast Highway. It would have been driving right along the shore, and you would have seen Miami Beach over to the side. And Miami Beach at the time, by the way, was a barrier island. It was mostly mangrove. It would have been half the size that it is now. That also is dredged up. So yes, this is Flagler, and then that's Biscayne. Okay, and these are the conditions that people were sort of living in before the town was set up. There was a housing shortage, of course. So I really love these pictures of people in these subtropic hardwood forests, you know, kind of just hanging out in their fancy wear, you know, dirty in their fancy wear. You know, here's a tent they would hang out in. So this is all before the railroad comes down. All right, blah, blah, blah. That's an early road to Coconut Grove. And bada bing, bada boom, the railroad comes down. And 3 months later, on July 28th, 1896, without ever having been a town or a village or any sort of municipal entity at all, Miami springs into existence. And right here, in this building right here, which is a pool hall, on July 28th, 1896, 600 folks voted to incorporate in this building right here. And in 1996, for the Miami's 100-year anniversary, they planted a palm tree right here. So this is where Miami was incorporated right here. And it really kind of gives you a little perspective on how much highways changed the environment. I was talking to somebody earlier about how highways have really ruined cities. You see you have a streetscape right here, and it would have been developed by the time the highway came in, but all gone for the highway. But this is exactly where Miami was incorporated in 1896. A few months later, Henry Flagler finishes his Royal Palm Hotel. Look at that, beautiful. This is an artist rendering. We have some photos too. So again, the Miami River, downtown Miami, Brickell, and then the Everglades down through here. Okay, we have some more Henry Flagler hotels. All right, there we go. Now, a real nice thing that Henry Flagler did, what a nice guy. He would keep the Royal Palm Hotel. Well, let me preface this. Let me say that Miami was very much a seasonal town. For the first 15, 20 years, the hotel was only open for 3 or 4 months. It was for the tourism season, and then it shut down. And it was just empty for the rest of the year. And the town really shut down too, and it was more of a agricultural economy. It was a part-time town. It wasn't a full-time town. But Henry Flagler was so nice, oh my God, and he let them use the pool year-round, and the Royal Palm Hotel became very much a community center. Oh, I also need to bring up, very important, I always like to harp on this, is that when Miami did incorporate in 1896, it was 600 folks. They were all men. 300 were black. 400 were white. And I think it's around 700. Yeah, is that what it added up to? Yeah, it's 700. Excuse me. Thank you for the math, Chuck. 700 folks, give or take. 300 African American and 400 white. And it's really kind of depressing to realize that Julia Tuttle, you know, the mother of Miami, the founder of the city, the person who petitioned to get this this isolated wilderness transformed into the city that it is today, she was unable to cast her vote, and she died a couple years after the city incorporated. And she's buried at Miami City Cemetery. There she is. I'm sure if you all have hung out there, like, you know, you would have seen it. So our story goes on to Flagler Street. So this is an early view of Flagler Street in the 1910s, right? There's the ocean, right? So this is a parade, and you would see lots of parades. Now this one's really sweet. All right, Miami's first skyscraper. This is Burdine's, built in 1913. And Burdine's has an amazing history. Miami was founded the same year as the city, 1896, in Bartow, Florida. But they came to Miami in 1898, William and Roddy Burdine. And that's a whole really cool story, but this is just sort of gives you a little insight into the life of Miami in the 1900s and then the 1910s, right? This is a really cool structure, completely gone. This is North Miami and Flagler. That was the Halcyon Hotel. Really, look at that. I mean, we don't really have that sort of Victorian kind of spires and that medieval kind of spires. We have a lot of Mediterranean architecture. We have a lot of Spanish architecture from back in the day, but we've lost a lot of that stuff. So, shame. Okay, so I put this picture up because Miami, unfortunately, was very segregated. It was a town of the South, even though it was so disconnected from the South. And it's interesting to note that before Miami incorporated, relations between the Bahamians and the African Americans and whites were actually comparatively pretty okay, because you had a frontier town, rules weren't really implied, there wasn't an infrastructure for segregation, and what we're going to see is that city building in the United States, there was an infrastructure for segregation, there was an infrastructure for racism, and that infrastructure was sort of homogenized in South Florida, and African Americans and people of color were confined to the northwest corners of the cities. So this is an early view of Overtown. At the time, for its first 40 years of history, it was called Colored Town. Okay, it was very packed, all wood frame homes. Even when Miami switched over to concrete because of fires and whatnot, Overtown remained neglected. And it's actually a very sad story of what happened to Overtown. It's also a story of perseverance in the face of adversity and gentrification. So here we have some images of Overtown. That was more of a commercial district right here, and here we have more of the living conditions, right? So while Overtown was certainly overpopulated and the conditions weren't great, there was a great sense of pride for the area. It became and I'm skipping ahead because I'd like to finish this story. Overtown became an entertainment hub. Black entertainers in the 50s and 40s would perform on Miami Beach, but they couldn't stay there, so they would go back to Overtown and play another night, a second set in Overtown. And you would even have white folk coming into Overtown to catch, these like intimate performances, right? Unfortunately, in the 1950s and 60s, Overtown was completely fucked over by the building of I-95, a great evil snake carving through our city. The population was something like 16,000 in Overtown, and it cut back to, I think it was 8,000, just under 8,000 after the highway was built. And what happened to those folks? Where did they go? They went all to Liberty City, which when it was built was very much a modern sort of, it was the first instance of public housing in South Florida, and it was really modern. It had plumbing and all this, and pork and beans it was called, and it was described by old heads as a place you could kind of leave your door unlocked. But unfortunately, this giant group of people were displaced, and they all moved into Liberty City and Liberty Square, and then that really became overpopulated. So I went a little ahead of the story. I just want people to know what happened to Overtown and how evil I-95 is. I avoid it every time I can. All right, so now we're getting into the sort of golden age and the tail end of our story, which is the 1920s. And the 1920s are defined by absolute wealth, speculation, land speculation, development, nearsighted greed, right? So, and it all kind of blows back in their face, right? And that's where we're going to end our story. I just gave away the ending, but whatever. So, let's see. So, where are they getting this land, Malcolm? I mean, Miami didn't have that much land. I mean, you had like 7 miles between Biscayne Bay and the Everglades. I mean, there's not that much. Oh my God, this is one of the saddest pictures I've ever seen. This is an advertisement west in the Everglades. Once they started draining it, right? Land's now being reclaimed, the richest soil in the world, the deep muck, big crops, year-round season. Buy now at ground floor prices, Realty Securities Corporation, Miami. And then you have the Seminole woman just kind of meandering past what was left, the little of what was left of, they were allowed to settle on, which originally wasn't even a desirable location. So they started draining the Everglades. And, interesting story, the guy responsible for initiating the draining of the Everglades, his name was Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, right? Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. So, and the way they did it's really kind of interesting. It's absolutely disgusting. It's heinous. What happened, I mean, the Everglades was irrevocably changed, the flow of the waters. It's been absolutely ruined by draining, and we're spending billions of dollars trying to fix it, even though it can never really be fixed and put back how it was. But we see that there was a lot of reclaiming. They would dig the canals, like Miami River, they cut it at a deeper slope, so the water would drain quicker, right? And the Everglades, it would drain water from the Everglades into Biscayne Bay. So we see that happening, right? And then, so people start, what we see now is the beginning of the great Florida land boom, all right? So places like Coral Gables started developing. Coral Gables was originally a grapefruit plantation run by the Merrick family. Oh. Right, and so eventually you had these folks with all these giant tracts of land, and the Coral Gables plantation, it was post-slavery, there were no slaves. The Coral Gables, there was exploitation, surely. The Coral Gables plantation was the largest producer of grapefruit in the world, which was this exotic fruit at the time. People were really kind of super into it, and guava as well. They had a guava farm, but they had thousands of acres. And what one sees is this land is starting to become more valuable in terms of development than it might be in terms of agriculture. So you have all these sort of farmer types farmer turned developer types in the 1920s. So you see now in the 1920s, the Miami Herald and the Miami Daily News, the two major newspapers at the time, became so bloated with these advertisements hawking land, right? People were selling land like fucking crazy. Here's a land auction in Coral Gables. That's Doc Dammers, right? He's a land auctioneer. It was him for Halloween 2 years ago. And here's him selling some land to some folks in Coral Gables. The first time they sold land in November 1921 was the first lot of land sold in Coral Gables. And there were all these sorts of marketing ploys to bring people down here. They were trying to bring all these people from New York, from the north, all these snowbirds, and they were, you know, Miami, the magic city where summer spends the winter. Miami's, or South Florida's Riviera, right? And they really kind of harped on this Spanish heritage, right? We see here that there's a lot of Spanish, it's a motif, right? This sort of Spanish presence, and we'll see that deeply ingrained in our architectural traditions moving forward. So there were all these ploys. People would come to Flagler Street, and you can get in this really cool fucking bus off Flagler Street in the 1920s, and they would take you to Coral Gables, which would have been out in the middle of nowhere, and they show you all the homes that they built. Here are some typical Coral Gables single-family residential home. So this we see has got a lot of aspects of Mediterranean revival-style architecture, which is an invented style. It's not, there was no Mediterranean kind of architecture that was distinct like this. This is a new style of architecture that was really an architectural collage that worked a lot with Spanish architecture, mission-style architecture, with Moorish architecture, and a little colonial, right? So we're seeing here, we've got mission style, right? These parapets going up through here. It's very layered. The curved archways, it's a big 20s thing. Barrel tile roofs, that's a big sign of 1920s architecture and in its use in Mediterranean revival style. Okay, so let's take a look at another development when, you know, things were going so crazy. Hialeah, right? Hialeah was developed by a very interesting person, Curtis Bright. And Hialeah means grassy plains, if I'm not mistaken, and it was really just a pine prairie, and Curtis Bright was like a cow farmer. He was a cow farmer, and then he turned his plots into Hialeah, and then later Miami Springs. So here you see that they're using a lot of Seminole sort of imagery to really sell the land, and they so much so that Hialeah, this is a gentleman named Tiger Tail Jack. He was a Seminole who lived in one of the Seminole camps along the Miami River, and he became very famous with white folk in the area, and he was very much seen as a sort of bridge between the Seminole out in the Everglades and the Miamians, and he had a very big following. He was a big personality, so he got a big fucking billboard. And they used him to advertise Hialeah. When you would come into Hialeah, you would see this. Here's some examples of some 1920s Hialeah homes. Now, here we see a little bit more adobe style, right, over here. And then we see more Spanish, Mediterranean, or some more mission styles, Mediterranean, very typical. I'm sure you all have seen homes like this, and when you do, it's very likely that they're from the 1920s, okay? Look, again, with the gimmicks, all these trucks, they get all these people from New York and stuff to come see Hialeah, and people are just selling land like crazy. It was like Bitcoin. It was out of control. The amount of building that was happening was so fast. It's Miami, in terms of development, would have looked a lot like it does right now, where there's cranes everywhere, where there's the scaffolding for buildings being put up everywhere. It was so much a phenomenon that you had this thing called binder boys, and binder boys would sell land off of Flagler Street, just like they were fucking churros in Hialeah or something like that. You know, they were hawking land off the side of the street. You know, so it was going crazy, and you know, people, nothing bad's gonna happen. This is great. We're making so much money. Blah blah blah. Miami Beach was playing the game, and it just gets more and more bloated. Look at this land stuff. Look at how many people are there. And these land sales in the 1920s very much became a cultural sort of gathering. I mean, there would be entertainment, and there would be raffles, and there would be prizes. It was very much eventizing this sort of development of what would become eventually an almost extinct environment, right? The Pine Rocklands. So we're seeing that the population is shooting up like fucking crazy in the 1920s. Here's the Royal Palm Hotel, right? North bank of the Miami River, where downtown Miami is. Here you have all these Model Ts. And you're starting to see that the infrastructure that's in Miami at the time isn't really up to date with the amount of people who are moving into the city and the amount of people who are buying land. Here are some Miami, some iconic Miami structures
Freedom
that were
Tower.
built in the 1920s.
Holy shit. No way.
No, there's not the Freedom Tower here.
Oh my god.
But good. So this building, the Biltmore, and the Rooney Plaza Hotel, which is now gone, they were built by the same architects who did the Freedom Tower. It was the architectural firm from New York called Schultz and Weaver. And the Freedom Tower, which we do have, so let me go over this. This is the courthouse downtown under construction.
Shit.
And, my friend, we have the Freedom Tower, as what we know as the Freedom Tower. Now, the Freedom Tower originally was a newspaper building. It was the headquarters for the Miami Daily News. Imagine the amount of wealth, disgusting wealth, that must have been made that a newspaper could go in a building like this off Biscayne Bay. And they built it in a year. It's absolutely incredible how quick they build things.
Fake news. It's
Right
fake
over
news.
here, right over here, we have the Olympia Theater under construction. Right, there's Flagler, the Olympia Theater, and let's take a look at how much more bustling Flagler Street is. Right, so everything's great. Everybody's making money. The prices of land keep going up. You can buy some land today, sell it tomorrow, make $1 million, and go hang out in Flagler Street, and then do it again the next day. Nothing's gonna go wrong, right? Nothing ever goes wrong. All right, so more views of Flagler Street really developing. Right here, until in 1926, September 17th and 18th of September 1926, Miami was hit by one of the largest hurricanes that has ever been reported in South Florida, up to par with Andrew. And Miami was completely caught with his pants down. We're talking about a time where we didn't realize that we couldn't tell when these storms were forming out in the Canary Islands. I mean, people knew very little about the structures even of hurricanes. That it's a donut shape. It's completely foreign. The fact that there's a wall and there's an eye, and then you're hit with the second wall. People didn't know this, and there was a storm, and the Miami Herald didn't really report it because the Miami Herald is very much kind of the hype man for Miami. They were always saying, everything's going great, look at all this land, everything's awesome. And they didn't want to scare people away with a storm. And they didn't understand storms much, so they didn't really report it as much as they should. And on September 17th, starts getting some hurricanes, and people are starting to get freaked out. You're getting some hurricane force winds. People are starting to freak out, and the night goes through, and it's not that bad. And everyone walks out, and it's like, oh, that was pretty scary, oh my God. And then the fucking wall hits, and that's when the second wall hit, the eye of the storm passed, and that's when we really lost a lot of people and a lot of infrastructure, right? There's the Freedom Tower, or the Miami Daily News building, right behind. See some of the destruction. There's a building all fucked up. There's a boat on the land where it doesn't belong, right? So Miami was really in a place where it was making a lot of money, where it was really building itself, and a lot of what Miami is today was really developed in the 1920s. And this 1926 hurricane really served as a sort of catalyst for what was inevitable, which was the collapse of this land boom, of this real estate bubble. And it did just that. Miami went into a horrible depression in 1926. It lost a huge portion of its population. A lot of its infrastructure was ruined. People were scared to move down there. And we entered the Great Depression 3 years earlier than the rest of the nation. And that's it. Right.